Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. It seems that human mind is not really good at grasping the size of large numbers. The jump from a million to a billion to a trillion is staggering. Recently, a writer described the COVID-19 threat as a crisis of maths. His argument, humans don't understand exponentials. In other words, we can't, or at least the non-maths minds cannot, figure out how one index patient can lead to a pandemic and how and why it increases exponentially. Already over 2.7 million people across the world have been infected. 191,423 have died, while 751,805 have recovered. These numbers have jumped just from the other day. The total number refers to both the closed and active cases, while recoveries and the mortality rate refer to closed cases. There are likely to be more deaths in the active cases. Countries and governments are grappling with effective strategies. And the dilemma, flatten the curve or flatten the economy. Sweden has chosen to stay open. It also has the highest number of infected cases as well as deaths of all the Nordic states. Others have oscillated between lockdowns and partial opening up. Even as scientists and labs race against the time to find a vaccine, mathematicians, epidemiologists, and economists are putting out papers using models to figure out the best possible approach. But there are many unknowns, and policymakers are making decisions under uncertainty. We are also learning, but there's a price. Meanwhile, the US and European states have demanded that China shut down the wildlife wet markets. Similarly, while many sectors in global and local economies have taken a terrible hit, some are raking it in. Are we looking at some kind of rearrangement of how Homo economicus is going to operate post-COVID-19? Let's talk about these issues with our panel of experts. We are joined today by Carl Jha, an expert on US-China relations and great power competition, Michele Geraci, former Italian Undersecretary of State for Economic Development, and we will also be joined later by Vickey, Pryce, who's an economist and former joint head of the United Kingdom's Government Economic Service. Let's begin with Mr. Geraci. Mr. Geraci, there are multiple approaches that we are looking at, lots of modeling going on, but there are many variables and many unknowns. Give me a sense of where we stand in terms of, dealing with the dilemma of either flattening the curve or flattening the economy.
I don't think it's actually a dilemma. One solution that I have advocated here in Italy is that a complete lockdown done early enough and done well would have been both in the interest of containing the virus and also of the economy, because we would have taken a hit maybe for 1 month, but then the recovery would have been quicker and more speedy. Rather than not being able to take strict measures, the effect is that the problem just lingers for the several weeks, for several months, and both the economy and the health situation do not get solved. So my view is that really there is no dilemma if things are done right. But I listened with interest to what you said. You said that the general public does not understand maths and exponential maths. My fear is that some politicians don't understand it either, and their underestimate of the risks I think has been the cause of continuous and even increasing problems.
Okay, so one of the sort of flattening the curve is to actually act very quickly, very early, and go for a lockdown, and then try and flatten the curve. But once that does not happen, and the spread begins exponentially, then there is a real problem with how to go about it, because the healthcare systems obviously get overwhelmed, and at the same time, the economy begins to take the hit. And as I said, there are lots of unknowns, and this is decision-making under uncertainty. So now give me a sense of, let's take the example of Italy right now. Italy was one of the worst hit. Where do things stand now?
We stand with a very high number of cases. Around 25,000 people have died. And the economy this year is expected to go down -10, but to be honest, I think it will be more closer to -15. And that's not the end of the story, because we are running the risk of having entire sectors not just go down this year, but completely wiped out for the next several years. Tourism, it's not just the tourists that don't come to Italy this year. It's the fact that many hotels, restaurants, and all the chain will go down, will disappear. And so even if tourists want to come to Italy next year, there won't be places to go, because we will risk to have what we call it desertification of the output of the supply. And this is true in many sectors: manufacturing, tourism, fashion also takes a hit. And the problem is that this could be a very, very serious impact on the Italian economy and society. And as I said, I re-emphasize it. I think policymakers do not get it. They don't understand how serious this is. That's why we are now, you asked me what's going on in Italy, we are now talking about reopening next week on May 4th, but we are reopening without giving people masks, protections. It's not clear which sectors can reopen and why. We are debating young people, old people. The thing is, it's all done on the impetus of the moment, without in-depth analysis. And without analysis of what can be reopened, how far, what happens to transport, one seat every 3 on a plane, every 5, everyone just wakes up in the morning and says their own views. We lack a serious analytical plan. This is my snapshot of the situation of Italy now.
Okay. I'm going to return to you, because I also talked about a certain kind of rearrangement. Perhaps, as I said, the Homo economicus needs to begin to rethink how economies are shaped. But let me, for now, go to Mr. Jha. Mr. Jha, let's start with a simple question of what the US and the European countries have been saying with reference to wildlife wet markets in China. Apparently, there are some reports that the Chinese government began sort of clamping down on them. What exactly is the situation?
So I want to make a distinction between a normal wet market, which is just a farmer's market where fresh farm produce are brought to the general public, which is very widespread, and normally they sell normal fresh farm-produced meats. And there's also the wildlife game market, which is a market where more exotic animal parts were being sold. So there are two separate things.
Correct.
And there's no shutting down wet market in general, because that's just like a normal farmer's market where most people
which is why I said wildlife wet markets, the exotic animals.
Yeah. Yes. Now, so according to Chinese laws, right, the consumption of wildlife animal parts is very restricted, and it is banned. But the problem is with law enforcement, because for most of the local government, they, for longest time, they have different priorities. Before the COVID-19 crisis really break out, the most Chinese local government officials are concerned with economic growth, with curbing the pollution, right? So the enforcing the wildlife protection laws is normally on the bottom list of the priorities. So even though the laws were there, most of the time they're just not enforced. But with this COVID-19 crisis that really hits home, now the Chinese central government is really going to pay attention to make sure all the local officials are now enforcing the laws on the book. Right?
Absolutely. So this is obvious. This is the learning curve. But let me, before I move on to, because you also deal with US-China relations, but before that, now here's the thing. The provincial government in the Hubei province as well as the Wuhan local government, now it's quite clear that there was a cover-up. Does that mean that they did not really at that point in time realize the gravity of the situation until, of course, the central government in Beijing got into play and then, things began to happen, lockdown and the rest of it. But do you think the local governments were trying to sort of cover up because they thought that this could sort of bring a bad name to their own performance?
Normally in China, the local officials are evaluated on an annual basis, right? Whether on the economic performance, whether on the environment protection enforcement, and what they want. The last thing they want to happen is a repeat of SARS epidemic back from 2003, and so the local government does have a very strong incentive to cover their tracks, right? And we know from the very beginning, the Wuhan government was trying to minimize the reporting on the pandemic, but you also have to keep in mind that this is a new epidemic. They did not realize this is a new coronavirus until December, when the Chinese scientists were finally able to do a DNA sequence of this new virus, and that's when they realized this is a brand new form of coronavirus, and it's highly contagious. So there was a initial learning curve as well. So the first patient they had a confirmed cases was back in December, and it's only by the late December is when they realized this is a very viral outbreak, and a lot of people, there's actually, they realize there's human-to-human transmission around mid-January, so around January 14th.
Absolutely. That was, no one really knew about this. But thank you so much. That was Carl Zhou speaking with us. Before I wrap up, let me go back to Mr. Geraci here. Mr. Geraci, as former Italian Undersecretary of State for Economic Development, I talked about rearranging the economy. Are there any lessons here in terms of this pandemic which we need to carry forward in terms of how we reshape the way we do business?
I think so. So it's a little bit early, but what we can see is I see more and not less globalization. This may be different from what we hear about. I think this pandemic will increase globalization. Maybe supply chains will be less dependent on China alone, but China supply could be replaced by manufacturing development in other countries. And so in a way, this is an opportunity for other countries in Asia, including yours and including other parts of Central Asia and also Africa. The development of online meetings and like the one we're having now actually will increase the contact between peoples of different parts of the world. Maybe less physical trips. Some of them maybe were not very useful in the beginning, and more online contact. And that will help develop online industry, online teaching, remote diagnosis for diseases, very, very important. And so we are moving more from a tangible into an intangible economy. And artificial intelligence, AI, and all these will develop. The question that we have to solve is how to manage the development of technology, which in some cases can be pervasive, with the containment of privacy. This is the big philosophical dilemma.
Absolutely. So much. That was Michele Geraci speaking. We are now joined by Vickey Pryce, an economist and former joint head of the United Kingdom's Government Economic Service. Let me ask you straight away, Ms. Pryce, you wrote in your book, Women versus Capitalism, and I'm quoting from that markets are good at finding the value of some things, but not others. Women are one of those others. And earlier, before you joined, I talked about rearranging or reshaping our approach to economics and economic activity. What do you think are the other things the markets can't value properly, especially if we look at it in terms of the present crisis?
Very interesting question, because of course we have been worried for quite some time that markets were not taking into account climate change issues and the sort of negative and positive externalities of doing something differently in the future, and the impact that this would all have on our economies if we didn't take into account properly in the pricing mechanism what the cost of sort of destroying the environment is. Now, we are here now, of course, in this crisis, and the question is, do we understand and do governments understand the balancing act that they may need to have? Because in reality, there are huge costs that are now borne by a large number of countries and many members of our communities. And on the other, of course, we need to be very well aware of what the health issues are. Now, the markets can't quite understand the sort of balancing act between them, and they're not pricing it properly. And what tends to happen in stock markets, for example, right now, is that every time there is an extra support package coming from governments, then they feel reasonably optimistic. But then we've seen the health issues are still very important, because without those, you can't, if you don't resolve them, you can't go back to work safely. So the moment we hear that one of the vaccine trials, as we've just been hearing today, isn't really working, or at least it didn't show signs of working early on, the markets collapse. And we've seen what's been happening in the UK, here in Europe, as a result of that. So they're very, very interlinked right now, and they can't necessarily separate and balance, if you like, the two areas out, health and the economy.
Absolutely. I'm happy about the environment part of it. Now, William Rees, he's a professor of ecological economics at the University of British Columbia. He recently wrote a piece titled "The Earth is Telling Us We Must Rethink Our Growth Society." Do you think there's a disconnect between what we call growth and what the Earth and its resources demand from us?
The interesting thing is that we're living in some sort of controlled experiment, and economists can't really always isolate various things that are happening and be able to do like scientists do in a laboratory. But we're seeing what the impact is on the environment of stopping production in many countries, of stopping flying. But we also know that the cost to the economy, to mental health, to people's employment prospects have been huge and are likely to continue to be very large. So the question is, do we rethink the way in which environmental measures need to be applied in the future? And do we need perhaps to cooperate a lot more and put a lot more money into innovation and investing in the green economy so that we can have growth and have it green? Now, of course, we all talk about this all the time. How can you combine the two? There is a lot of evidence that, in fact, you can. If you look at what's been going on to car production, you regulate the emissions that you want to have. Yes, there have been some scandals on the diesel front, as we know, with Germany at the forefront of that. But what we have seen is that markets have reacted positively. There has been a lot of innovation and investment going into alternative ways in which cars can move, not just electric, but also improving the engines and making sure that the cars, there's so many more, actually emit a lot less. So we can have both if we do this properly and jointly.
Absolutely. For years, we have been witnessing what I would say a symptom of human ecological dysfunction. But here's the thing, because of this threat, lots of conferences, classroom teaching has been going online. People have stayed off roads. That has essentially meant basically improved air quality index. For instance, in the city that I live, Lahore, certainly the AQI has improved tremendously. Now, are we going to carry these lessons forward even after this threat has sort of tapered off and actually say, right, I don't have to physically drive, go from point A to point B. Offices could be reshaped in terms of, the learning processes, conferences, whether official or track to, all of this, or do you think we're just going to go back to our old bad habits?
I think there's going to be quite a lot of change in the way in which we operate. There's no doubt about that. But health issues are going to come into this too, because until we have a vaccine, quite a lot of firms are not going to want to bring the people back the way they were before, even if restrictions are eased. So we're going to have the trust that the whole issue has been resolved before we can return to normal, if that's what we want to do. But you're absolutely right. There are now two new ways of working, and they're quite helpful to the environment. But we need to remember that platforms like Google and others, and if we use an awful lot of Zoom, Facebook, and so on, if you use all these new ones that are emerging for meetings, they all still consume quite a lot of energy. We had forgotten that those big digital companies are actually huge energy users. So we absolutely need to continue to improve the source of energy and where it comes from, so that at least that remains green, or is as green as we possibly can. But also I think the markets will come into this, since you asked me that at the very beginning. The reality is that if we are still going to be having social distancing measures, actually flying is going to become much more expensive, because you can't fly the planes at full capacity as you used to before. There are going to be issues in terms of which companies survive in that sector. But if you're going to be flying an aeroplane with only a third of the capacity, because you can't put more people in it because of health reasons, then it's going to cost the individual who's on it a lot more. So businesses are going to reconsider whether it's actually worth doing it. So there will be quite a lot of changes. With it, I think one whole area where we've all been depending on commercial property, are we still going to need all these offices in the future that people have been investing in? I think some of it will go back without any doubt, but I think we have got the chance to rethink the way in which work is in fact organized for the future. I think the markets will help us in a way.
Absolutely. I think we, and especially President Trump's administration, definitely needs to rethink about its approach to the environment. But thank you so much. That was Vickey Pryce speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to continue with our discussion of COVID-19 and its challenges. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of COVID-19 and its challenges. As the world grapples with the COVID-19 crisis, scientists are struggling to find a vaccine. How exactly does that process work? What are its steps? What do we mean by a vaccine, or when a vaccine is ready? How long does it take? How effective would it be whenever it comes online, etc.? Lots of questions here and lots of unknowns too. So let's dive straight into our discussion. We are joined today by Professor Neuman, Professor and Chair of Biological Sciences at Texas A&M University, and Darya Unutmaz, Human Immunologist at the Jackson Laboratory in Connecticut. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Professor Neuman. Professor Neuman, just hold my hand and walk us through this. There's lots of misinformation, lots of stuff that people don't really understand because we're not experts about, and we hear these reports that some vaccines are about to come online or they have come online. Is that correct? How does this process work?
Yeah. So right now in the world, there are 7 different vaccines listed by the World Health Organization as being actually in development and in either phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trials. So phase 1 is going to be just generalized safety testing on healthy individuals. And when we get to phase 2 and 3, this is now a situation where it actually may be in somebody who is going to be at risk for contracting COVID-19. What the vaccines do is just try to give the immune system an education, a really fast education, and they try to make it stick. And to do this, you have to be fairly harsh with the immune system. There are different ways that they will try to amplify the sort of harshness of these vaccines in a way that the immune system will actually remember. It seems that the sicker you get with some things, the more likely you are to develop an immune response that will actually protect you down the road. I think the challenge of this, though, is that we're starting to see some reports from other coronaviruses and from this coronavirus that some of the aspects of immunity, like some of the neutralizing antibodies, for example, don't appear to last as long as might be hoped. And so this may be a case where it's not one vaccine that takes you through your entire life. You may have to get vaccinated annually, more like the flu than something else, like polio, for example.
Okay. So before the phase 2 clinical trials, is there an early animal stage where the vaccine is tested, or we go straight to the humans?
Definitely animal stages, and quite often there'll be multiple animal stages for each of these. So in addition to those 7 vaccines that are somewhere along the process in humans, there's a list of, it looks like more than 50 and fewer than 100 vaccines where the actual product is made and is not yet in humans, but is being tested out in animals, or is being ramped up. It takes quite a lot of any of these vaccines to actually dose a human effectively. And so it can take a little while to get enough and get all the paperwork together and all the doctors and all the patients that you would need to even begin a clinical trial. There's also the issue of money. Clinical trials are very expensive. They involve a lot of doctors and a lot of hospital time. And this can be a challenge in getting some of these tested. But out there, among all of these options, there is a really nice variety of different approaches to the coronavirus, ranging from inactivated vaccines to live attenuated vaccines to subunit vaccines, RNA and DNA. There's a very good chance that something on this list is going to work, I would say, but we aren't going to know what until we've actually done the trials. And so I'm very excited and interested to see what comes out of these.
Well, consider you're a scientist. Everyone else's worry is your excitement. But let me go to Mr. Unutmaz. Mr. Unutmaz, so how does this work in the sense that, you get people, volunteers for the clinical trials, and you inject them with the vaccine, and they're supposed to develop antibodies, and then you see whether they get infected? Or is it that you actually get the infected people and then use the vaccine to see how they get cured?
Yeah, so vaccine development is a very complex process, actually. I mean, we don't have vaccines for certain viral infections like HIV, and we've been trying for almost 40 years. So there is an incredible effort for this coronavirus to develop, as the previous speaker very nicely told us, there are almost 100 different trials, both at the lab level, and some of them have moved to the human level. Now, it's a long process, because what you're trying to do is that normally your body mounts an immune response. So if you think of this as kind of a war within ourselves, the virus is the enemy, and you're trying to develop all these defense mechanisms to destroy it and to eliminate it from the body. And this also has some sort of a memory. So you are developing these missiles like antibodies, and they will remain there for a while. How long, we don't know. As the previous speaker said, that might be for 6 months, a year, or sometimes for lifelong. But in order to test this, first we need to understand what is really protective, because the immune system is very complicated. You have many parts of the immune system that can protect you. There are, special forces that will find these few infected cells and go and destroy them. There are these missiles that will stop the virus from entering into the cells that we call antibodies, and so on and so forth. So we still haven't understood what will be the actual protective vaccine. The excitement is, as previous speaker said, there's a lot of different approaches being tried. And then we're also working on the lab environment to figure that out. Now, how we will know this, the first phase is phase 1, where you want to see that the vaccine you're developing is not hurting you, that doesn't have a side effect. And that's a possibility, especially for these viruses, that if you don't do the right type of vaccine, it could actually make things worse. So we need to know that first. And then in the second phase, and then the third phase, which are much larger groups of people, you have to try this in thousands and actually tens of thousands of people, and in an environment where there's still virus. For example, if you started this trial in China, that's going to last forever, because right now there are very, very few cases in China. So you want to do you want to find these people in areas like in the U.S. where there are a lot of infections going on, but these people should be uninfected people. So if those who have already taken the virus, they're kind of like self-immunized by the virus itself. So you want to see that those who have not taken the virus, and when you vaccinate them with these particular formulations, you need to wait for a while. That could be months, because you want to see the 10,000 people that you gave the vaccine were not infected in the 3 or 6 month period, whereas the other 10,000 you gave something else, some sort of a placebo type of a thing, and those got infected much more. So you have to see, and that's a process you cannot shorten. This is the reason why we say, even if there are very hopeful vaccine formulations now in the lab or in the animals, it will take at least a year and a half before we see these in the market, because let's just imagine by the end of this year, everything went extremely well, and we found out very, very exciting formulations that seem to work in the humans. Then you need to ramp up your production. I mean, you have to make hundreds of millions of doses of these, if not billions, and then you have to vaccinate the whole world. And that's a huge challenge. It will take, I think, a multi-institutional, multinational effort to build these factories and other processes, logistics to be able to do this. So it's a really difficult process, but we are hopeful because no time in history such an effort has been done, in my opinion, for any disease or any pathogen in such a short period to move this forward.
Absolutely, given the changes. But let me go back to Professor Neuman here. Professor Neuman, so one of the things which is clear to me as a layperson, that there are some people, even without a vaccine, who got infected, but their body's immune system fought it off, the missiles, as Mr. Unutmaz was saying. And now, since you said that there's 7 vaccines listed by the World Health Organization, work is being done on that, clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2. You also said that it's very expensive. Mr. Unutmaz said that it could take anywhere from a year to a year and a half. So in the meantime, we are also witnessing people getting infected and recovering. Do we also study those who are recovered in order to see how they got recovered? What was it that allowed their bodies to fight it off without any vaccine available?
Absolutely. And these are difficult studies to do, but we've already seen some of these studies come in. So it's not as simple as a crime scene investigation. In the body of a person that has had COVID-19, you're going to find lots of different markers of immunity. So 2 of the big ones are going to be the antibodies, as you mentioned, and the cells that produce those. And also the other component is going to be T cells. So we think the antibodies are probably most useful in preventing you from getting infected in the first place. Although there are a few antibodies, a small percentage of the ones that people make, that would actually really help out even during the process of controlling the virus. The T cells, however, are really interesting, and we haven't seen a whole lot of work on these yet. A T cell is a type of cell that's going to go to an infected cell, and if it recognizes a trace of virus there, it's going to destroy that cell. Thankfully, we have lots of extra cells in our body, essentially, and so we can stand to lose a few of these, especially the ones that are infected. In other coronavirus infections and RNA virus infections in general, sort of this type of virus, those T cells are absolutely the key to recovery once you actually have caught the virus. So yeah, antibodies prevent, T cells help recover. And right now we're just learning about both of these. There are very good predictive models that I've seen from a couple different laboratories. And they're looking at the range of things that the immune system might see. But the other thing that we know is that part of the way that you recognize these antigens is going to be determined by your genetics. So you will have inherited from your mother and father certain copies of these, certain versions of these genes that recognize viruses like COVID-19. And if you inherited the right ones, it's going to be a much easier process, much smoother to actually making immunity. And if you inherited sort of unlucky ones that don't happen to grab anything that the virus makes particularly well, then it's going to be much more difficult probably to make a full immune response. And right now, we know a little bit about this for other viruses. We know something about this for the flu virus or Ebola virus, but we know very little about what it is that the cells in the body actually recognize as part of the immune response in humans. So yeah, that's definitely something that people will be looking at actively right now. And once again, yeah, these things excite me. I'm very interested to read about.
No, it is fascinating. I mean, ever since this entire thing started, I basically got down to doing my own research as a layperson, and of course, speaking with experts like you. So, on that note, one of the things that I realized during this research was that the 1918 flu pandemic, which it's a terrible misnomer calling it the Spanish flu because it never started in Spain. But it was only in 2008 that the scientists figured out why it was so virulent. So it took almost 90 years. Now, have we already started understanding this particular virus, or it's going to take us a long time to actually figure out what made it such a killer?
We are definitely starting to understand it. I think there's an interesting story behind that flu. The virus had actually gone extinct, and they had to dig up a corpse and reassemble the pieces of the virus in order to be able to do those tests. So that was a really neat story. But as far as SARS coronavirus 2, yes, we are starting to learn what makes it more severe in some people and less severe. There are 2 preprints that are out. So these aren't fully vetted scientific papers yet, but they come from really good labs, and they're in the process of review. So they should be published very soon, and probably with relatively few edits, if my assessment is correct. And what these show is that there are 2 proteins that we already knew about that it takes for a coronavirus to get into a cell. So the coronavirus has proteins, but the cell has to be making 2 proteins at the same time. And if it's only making one of those or not making very much of one of those, then the cell is going to be resistant. And what we see is that in children, the levels of these proteins are generally lower. And so there are just fewer cells that the virus is able to infect. And as time goes on and we get older, they looked at, I think, 3-month-old, 3-year-old, and 30-year-old people. They noticed that the expression pattern changes. And these 2 factors start to appear in higher abundance and on more types of cells, which just means that the virus has an easier time to get into cells, and it becomes a more difficult problem to get it back out again. And
Absolutely.
so that seems to be most of the difference. Yeah.
Absolutely. Before I rapidly go back to Mr. Darya Unutmaz, Mr. Unutmaz, is also some sense, there's so much talk about big pharma and the rest of it. So once the vaccines come online, there obviously, I'm assuming that certain government bodies approve of them, then they're commercially manufactured. So given the timeline here, given the expenses, given the rest of it, are we going to end up with something that will be cost prohibitive initially and then slowly the cost will taper off? What exactly are we looking at?
Yeah, I think that's an important question because that's going to be another huge problem. I think it will really depend on the type of formulation for the vaccine. There are some vaccines that are much cheaper to produce in terms of the formulation. There is a type of vaccine that's being tried right now. It's called an RNA vaccine, which basically it's a genetic code that you inject to the people, and the body makes the protein necessary to elicit this immune response, whereas others are trying to make the proteins, which is a much harder and much more expensive process. In fact, in U.S., Johnson & Johnson, I think in combination with U.S. government, are already building a facility that will cost about $1 billion or $2 billion, and they don't even know if their vaccine is going to work or not. But just as a preemptive way, they're investing that money. So it will definitely be a huge challenge to produce enough of these and then produce them at a relatively low cost. That's why I think this is going to be a multinational. Maybe the whole world will have to, and WHO probably has to be involved as well. Both to produce these in sufficient and costly manner and to distribute them. I mean, there's going to be regions where we cannot even get vaccines, the regular vaccines for children at this time. So it's definitely going to be a challenge. But I think hopefully once we have something working, we'll figure that part as well.
Yes, indeed, and that cost. I mean, if someone is investing $2 to $3 billion. What will be the return on that cost? But thank you so much. It's always great to speak with experts. It was extremely informative for me, and I'm sure also for my viewers. Thank you, Professor Benjamin Neuman, Darya Unutmaz. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.